This is Speaking of Speaking. Quick tips and tools to take you from stage fright to spotlight. This podcast gives you an inside look from the world of public speaking and the speaking secrets you need to be bold from the stage, no matter what business you're in. The host of Speaking, Carl Richards.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, it's another edition of the Speaking of Speaking podcast. So glad we are nearing episode number 60 and so thrilled that you're joining us today. It is such an exciting time in the world of speaking, and since the global pandemic, a lot of things have shifted to online speaking, virtual presentations, online summits. Now, in some parts of the world, things are starting to open up again, but certainly here where I am in Canada, things are still pretty much locked down, and I think for the next little while, we're going to see a hybrid of speaking. So what I wanted to talk about over the next few episodes, and this has come up previously where we talked about podcasting, but it's certainly very relevant, still very relevant today. So the next 3 episodes, it's speaking of your podcast. And if you don't have a podcast, it's certainly something you should be thinking about. So today we're going to talk about some things, 3 specific things actually. Number 1 is why you need a podcast. What are some of the current trends and what you can expect from that? We're also going to be talking about why you aren't podcasting and what you're missing out by not having a podcast. So why should you start a podcast? Well, number 1, not everyone is doing it. As a matter of fact, the stats keep changing because the number of podcasts out there keeps increasing substantially. There's now over 2 million podcasts worldwide. Back about 8 months ago, there were only 1.75 million podcasts. So in less than a year, podcasting has grown by over, by over 250,000, which is a substantial amount. Okay, so not everyone's doing it, so why not be innovative and do something that not everyone has jumped on the bandwagon with yet? It's portable. You can listen to it anywhere, which is very convenient. Now, some people listen to podcasts using YouTube, and they'll listen to YouTube channels while they drive. Well, with a podcast, you don't need to even worry about that. You just plug in your device and then listen to your podcast wherever you are. Or if you're going for a walk, or if you're at the gym, or if you're working out at home, wherever you're allowed to work out, you can certainly do that with a podcast. There's no limits on topics. There are no limits on content for those 2 reasons. And there are so many topics that podcasts cover. As a matter of fact, I was amazed, which when I thought about it a little bit more deeply, I wasn't overly surprised that one of the areas of growth for podcasting, religious organizations and affiliations. That's right. Churches are posting either their worship services or their best sermons or all kinds of different things that are engaging their congregation, which is, let's face it, a congregation is the church audience, and it's engaging them in the same way your typical podcast it would. So no limits on topics, no limits on content, because there is literally a podcast about everything. It's innovative, and there's a good chance that it's something that your competition, if you're doing a podcast for business, something your competition either isn't doing or isn't doing maybe the same way you would be doing it. And it shows that you're not afraid to do something different, right? So we talked about the number of podcasts currently, as of the recording of this episode, over 2 million podcasts, over 80% of the population worldwide between the ages of 18 and 55 have listened to podcasts. I'll say that again, over 80% or around 80% of the world's population between the ages of 18 and 55 have listened to a podcast. So ask yourself, could any of those people listening to podcasts, could they be your potential clients? Could they be prospects? Could they be people who are just waiting to find out more about you? And because you don't have a podcast, you're not finding them or they're not finding you. That's why you should start a podcast. Not everyone's doing it. And as a matter of fact, for every 500 blogs, if you're a blogger, here's a stat for you. For every 500 blogs, there's 1 podcast. So it's still the wild, wild west when it comes to podcasting. It's portability. You can listen anywhere in the car, while you're doing your morning walk, while you're doing the dishes. You can listen absolutely anywhere. There's no limits on topics. There's no limits on content. It's innovative. It shows you're not afraid to do anything different, and it really puts you ahead of the competition because of that. So let's look at the second part, and that's why you aren't podcasting. And I could probably guess what's on your mind. If I said, why aren't you podcasting? You might come up with one of these answers, or maybe several of them. Number one being, it's too expensive. There's a misconception that podcasting costs lots of money. Now, is there an investment that you should be making for podcasting? Absolutely. But if you need to do it on a budget, you can do it on a budget. You can do a podcast for less than $100 startup and under $50 a month. Now, mind you, if you have additional resources financially and you want to invest more deeply, then those options are also there. So you can spend $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year on a podcast too. But there's definitely room for a podcast regardless of your income level, regardless of where you are in business. A lot of people think also it's too time consuming. Well, and again, this goes back to the perception of content. A lot of people perceive that content has to be long form content. As a matter of fact, most of the people who I have trained in launching their podcasts and showing them how to do editing of audio and even some video editing, their content is short, between 10 and 15 minutes. Podcasts don't have to be 60 minutes long or even 30 minutes long. They can be, but they don't have to be. Not a fit for my business. Sometimes this is the pushback I get. They'll say, well, it's not a fit for my business, so that's why I'm not podcasting. Does it have to only be about your business? Well, if we already know there's no limits on topics or no limits on content, why can't your podcast be about your passion project or your hobby or something that you're interested about that just needs to come to the surface and show that there is a real side to you? There's a human side to you, not just all business. A lot of people say that the reason why they aren't podcasting is they're having a hard time trying to figure out how to make money with their podcast. Eliminate that from your mind right now. Think about it logically. If you look at podcasting as a marketing tool, how many marketing tools currently do you have that cost you money? Your computer is a marketing tool. You use it to do all your social media posts. And do you worry about how much you spend on your computer? Maybe you do. You have to budget for it. But are you overly concerned about it? Probably not. Do you worry about how much money you spend on Facebook ads? Some people spend tens of thousands of dollars a year on Facebook ads without even batting an eye, but will not start a podcast. So don't get hung up on the monetization aspect of things. More or less, think of ways that you can monetize once you've launched and have some credibility and have established that place in the marketplace in the podcasting world. And the biggest reason why some people don't start is they don't know where to start. They don't know where to begin the search for getting information about starting a podcast. I was like that. I didn't know what a podcast was until I had a colleague who said, you know what, you're a business person, you're an entrepreneur, you're doing speaker coaching, you should have a podcast. And I remember saying, what's a podcast? I was that dumb when it came to it. I had no idea. I didn't know where to start it, but I got some information. I took some training. Voila, I launched my podcast. I realized it wasn't that difficult. And then I asked myself, how many other people need to know about this? How many other people are struggling in their businesses that if they only had a podcast could have greater success because they'd be reaching a greater audience, their ideal audience? Think about that. And some people get hung up on building the audience. And building the audience goes right back to marketing. Again, if a podcast is a marketing tool, how can you use a podcast as a marketing tool with all your other marketing tools and marketing strategies you currently have in place? On to the third part. What are you missing by not having a podcast? I quite often attune podcasting to where websites were about 20 years ago. How many business people do you know, and maybe you're one of them, said, I don't need a website. My business runs fine without it. It probably wouldn't run as efficiently now if you didn't have a website. People are looking online, and people are gravitating more and more towards podcasts for getting their information and developing a know, like, and trust factor. They want to know more about you before they do business with you. If they know you have a book, they're possibly going to read your book. If they know you have a podcast, they're going to listen to podcast episodes that you have. They're going to follow you on LinkedIn. They're going to follow you on Twitter. They're going to do all of those things. But if you don't have a podcast, you're missing out on that. So you're missing out on potential clients you didn't even know you had. I have had clients come to me because I have a podcast, and now because I do podcast training. they've come to me that way as well. But because I have a podcast, I've had clients say, I heard your podcast. I want to find out more about you and see if we're a fit. You're also missing out on the global market because podcasts can be heard all over the world. So if there's a possibility you have clients overseas, you're missing out on that. As a matter of fact, I have a colleague, his name is Ron, and Ron is a business intermediary. He buys and sells businesses. That's what he does. He helps people buy a biz and sell a biz. That's actually the name of his podcast, Buy a Biz, Sell a Biz. And you know what? Within 6 episodes of having his podcast, he had a strong referral for a client who was looking to buy a business. And a client for Ron could be worth hundreds of thousands, if not into millions of dollars. Without a podcast, he could be missing out not only on a client, but the global market, which is where that client was coming from, the global market. How about sponsorship opportunities? Speaking of monetization, how about sponsoring a podcast? How about getting somebody to sponsor your podcast? How about sponsorship opportunities for events that are looking for your expertise? And because you have a podcast, that's how they found you. So there are sponsorship opportunities there too. Partnership opportunities. As a matter of fact, there's a woman by the name of Case Lane. She actually is a guest on one of our previous episodes. She found me through my podcast, and through discussion after the episode, we decided that at some point in the near future, we're still figuring out all the details, but we should partner together. We should collaborate somehow. And if it weren't for my podcast, Case would not have found me. I would not have found her immediately, for sure. So partnership opportunities that are out there that are just waiting for your podcast. How about business growth? And for that matter, business growth and monetary growth. A podcast can lead to more clients, which will lead to greater business, which will lead to more referrals, which will lead to more money. And who doesn't want to make more money if they're in business, where we know if you're an entrepreneur, the sky is the limit. Even the sky is not the limit. There is no limit. So if you're saying no to podcasting, are you saying no to growing your business? Are you saying no to growing your revenue and growing your income? If you are, maybe it's time to find out a little bit more about whether or not a podcast is for you. If you are interested in finding out more, I'm going to post a link to my Podcast Launch Made Simple Facebook group. It is a group that has almost 600 members in it now. I would invite you to join and invite your friends and colleagues to join as well. We share information on a regular basis every single day, and you're allowed to participate in the group for sure and get more information about whether or not a podcast is the right fit for you, for your business, for your passion project, overall. I also run workshop weeks on a regular basis and training seminars on podcasting. As a matter of fact, I have a 60 Days to Launch program, which is expanding beyond that. I'm creating another Facebook group, which will launch very shortly. So if you're hearing this a couple months after this posting, you'll probably be able to find another Facebook group, which will collaborate or put guests and hosts together. It's a host and guest collaboration Facebook page. And it's designed basically to do that, put hosts and guests together and have them networking and sharing on each other's platforms. So I hope this has been helpful. We're going to be talking in our next episode. As I said, this is a 3-part series. We're going to be talking about what you need to get started, the things you need to start your podcast for basically under $100 or around that mark. And by the way, remember, you can spend more money if you'd like, but if you're really doing it on a budget, you can get started for under $100, but there are opportunities, of course, to grow beyond that. We'll cover that all in the next episode. Until next time, it's Carl Richards. Get out there and own the platform.
Thanks for listening to the Speaking of Speaking podcast. Fired up about something you heard today? Want to learn more? Be sure to visit carlspeaks.ca. And don't forget to follow Carl on Twitter @CarlRichards72 or join the Facebook group Speaking of Speaking.